All right.
Welcome, everyone, to the Chinese American History Speaker Series, part of Asian American Studies, Asian American and Asian Diaspora Studies 121 class here at UC Berkeley. And my name is Harvey Dong, and I'm the instructor for this semester. First, I want to acknowledge that UC Berkeley sits on Ohlone land that's unceded. Uh, Next, in terms of comments, questions, and answers, please send them all in the chat box addressed to everyone. That way we can bounce off of each other's questions and Bruce can hear your comments. These events, this series of events is sponsored by Asian American and Asian Diaspora Studies, UC Berkeley, with the support from the Chinese Alumni Association chapter of UC Berkeley and Ethnic Studies Changemaker. Today I wanted to introduce Bruce Quan Jr., and he'll talk about his book, Bitter Roots, 5 Generations of a Chinese Family in America. A little bit about Bruce. Bruce Quan Jr. is a 5th generation Californian whose family relocated to Oakland in 1906 after the Great San Francisco earthquake. His great-grandfather, Lew Hing, founded the Pacific Coast Canning Company in West Oakland in 1905. It was one of the largest employers in Oakland. Bruce's talk will focus on the development of Chinatown organizations in which Lew Hing participated. So without further ado, Bruce Quan Jr. Okay, Bruce.
Thank you, Harvey. And thank you all for joining me this morning. Let me start off by telling you the genesis of the book and why I wrote the book. In May of 2020, I read an article in the paper and it was titled Coronavirus, What Attacks on Asians Reveal About American Identity. In that article, they talked about an incident that happened in Texas involving a young Asian American woman. Her friend, who was interviewed, a woman named Ms. Liu, made these comments in that article. When I came here 5 years ago, my goal was to adapt to American culture as soon as possible, said Ms. Liu. Then the pandemic made me realize that because I am Asian and because of how I look or where I was born, I could never become one of them. Now, Professor Dong has told you that my family came to Oakland in 1906, but before that, let me just tell you that I also noticed that there had been at least 2,800 incidents of anti-Asian incidents involving anti-Asians, of which in the Bay Area alone, there were 292 incidents. And most recently, there were the incidents involving San Francisco Chinatown and Oakland Chinatown. So let me just switch gears and ask all of you to think about what has happened to the Chinese since they first came. My great-great-grandparents on the paternal side first came to the United States in the 1850s, in the early 1850s. So my family has been here since from 1850s to the present time. Now, for discussion purposes, I want to divide up the discussion into 4 periods. The first period is from 1850 to 1930. The second period is 1930 to 1960. The third period is 1960 to 1990. And the fourth period is 1990 to the present time. Now, that first period involved my great-grandfather, Lew Hing, who had, as Professor Dong mentioned earlier, started a cannery in Oakland in 1905. However, before that, he was in San Francisco. Now, I want to talk first about having, particularly the students, put down period 1, period 2, period 3, and period 4. Now, during the time that my great-grandfather was in his ascendancy in business, the Chinese were not able to immigrate. The Chinese were not able to vote. The Chinese were not able to testify in court. The Chinese were not able to purchase property. The Chinese were not able to travel freely. The Chinese were not able to go to public schools. The Chinese could not use public facilities. And they couldn't live in certain areas. And obviously they had problems with finding jobs. Most of the jobs that were available were laborers' jobs. Against that backdrop, I will summarize my great-grandfather during that period of time. He came in 1869, and from 1869 to 1874, he worked in the family store called Hing in San Francisco, Chinatown. He came at the age of 11, born in 1858. With his older brother, he managed the store for 5 years. Now, his older brother, who was just several years older, died in 1872 on his way back to China, perishing in a boat accident. So he was left to manage the store from the age of, well, let's see, 13, probably 13 years old. In 1874, he formed a partnership with a Klansman. And he asked the Klansman to manage the store, giving him half of the ownership of the store without compensation. From 1875 to 1888, for 13 years, he worked in a white tin shop and also worked in a cannery. These were arranged by a white mentor that he found, who was a customs broker named Bellinghall. And Bellinghall would be instrumental in helping Lew Hing get to where he got to the cannery in Oakland in 1905. Now, from 1888 to 1902, Lew Hing, after mastering the tin making trade and learning how to process foods, opened his cannery on Stockton Street. It was called Pacific Fruit Packing Company, and it was right next door to the Chinese consulate. So he didn't have to, during this period of time, rely on any organizations in Chinatown to protect him, because he had the protection through his friendship with the consul generals from China. Now, from 1905 to 1927, he was actively involved in San Francisco Chinatown as well as in Oakland Chinatown. After the earthquake in San Francisco, he became active in forming some of the major businesses out of Chinatown, the first being the Canton Bank, of which he was first vice president and then president and the major investor. And the second was the China Mail Steamship Lines that was formed in 1915. He was the vice president and the chairman of the board. Now, what happened to my great-grandfather, which you will review if you read the book, is that he was ultimately taken down starting in 1923 to 1927 by the majority population. The government intervened and shut down the bank, even though it had enough assets. It drove the steamship lines into bankruptcy, the government seizing all of the assets of the steamship lines. And finally, they forced him to sell his cannery in 1927 to cover the debts. Now, I'm looking down because at this particular point in my life, sometimes I forget a lot of things. So just bear with me. So now Professor Zhang has mentioned that I would talk a little bit about the involvement of my great-grandfather Lew Hing in Chinese organizations while he was alive. He was involved first, and here's a question that I've been asked before. What is the difference between the Samyap and the Samyap, and why don't they like each other? And why didn't they like each other? That was a holdover from the animosity and antagonism that was festering in the 19th century in China, and it carried over into San Francisco. So the Samyap were the three districts around Canton, and the Seyu were the four districts around the western part, the west of the Pearl River Delta area. They did not like each other, and when you read the book, you wonder why my grandmother, that is Lew Hing's daughter, was married to my grandfather, the son of a Quan, because my Quan side was Samyap merchants and the Liu side were Seyu. So there's an interesting twist there, something that when you read the book, you'll wonder what the heck was going on there, because that happened during the boycott by the Seyu of the Samyap merchants in the late 1890s. Now, Lew Hing was involved in the family association, the Four Family Association, which was formed by the Samyap merchants in 1895. And it was formed because of the boycott, which I mentioned earlier. And they invited my great-grandfather, Lew Hing, the Seyu, to join them. Obviously, or perhaps because he was close to the Council Generals and he had the biggest business in Chinatown at the time, that is the Pacific Fruit Packing Company that he had started, which by that time had started to surround the consulate. Then, after the earthquake in 1906, where he had opened his cannery in 1905, and then by 1906, after the earthquake, he rescued the Chinese because the official relief agencies would not serve the Chinese after the earthquake. So from his own pocket, he took funds to buy tents, to hire cooks, to help thousands of Chinese who had fled to Oakland from San Francisco. That also is in the book. And then he went back into Oakland, into San Francisco, Chinatown. And if you're familiar with a building on the corner of California and Grand Avenue, then at that time, California and DuPont Street, it was called the Sing Chong Building. It's the most photographed building, and it was a import-export store that my great-grandfather was the major investor of before the earthquake. And then after the earthquake, he had the co-manager of the store, a gentleman named Lew Hing, rebuild the store. And Lew Hing fortunately had a connection with a very wealthy Cantonese importer. They rebuilt that store. A store across the street called Sing Fat was rebuilt. And both of those buildings were built in the faux Oriental style. That started the building down Grand Avenue of what is now the touristy appearance of Chinatown in San Francisco. Now in 1911, my great-grandfather was appointed the Ningyong representative to the Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association, also known as Six Companies. He served from 1911 to 1927. So he was involved in both the Family Association, involved in the Six Companies, and before that, he was involved in the Samyap Merchants Association. So those are the three main organizations that he was involved in while he was alive. He was also involved, I have no other information except for the fact that he was involved with two Tong associations. One was called Seyu in San Francisco, and the other, allegedly, he was involved with the Seyu in Oakland. In Oakland, he also owned two lotteries. So that is a little bit of my great-grandfather, which you will read more in depth when you read the book. Now, I want to move to the second period, which is the period where you still couldn't immigrate. You could vote now. Chinese could vote. Chinese could testify in court. The Chinese could purchase property. The Chinese still couldn't travel if they weren't citizens. And the Chinese couldn't live in certain areas. And of course, the Chinese still had problems finding decent jobs outside of Chinatown. They could now go to school. In fact, several of my relatives attended UC Berkeley in the early days, in the 1920s. Now, let me now take an opportunity. The second period, as I mentioned, was the 1930s to the 1960s. In that second period, I want to read a couple of quotes about what it was like. And these were stories that I elicited from both my parents and my grandparents. I asked my father, what was it like for you growing up? He replied, the 1920s were a period of anti-Chinese prejudice. We had to be very careful outside the house because we lived in a white neighborhood. I remember none of the white kids would play with me. I was very lonely and the white teachers were very abusive towards me. I told my father about the teachers and he said, this is their world. They never wanted us here, so there is nothing we can do. You need to remain silent no matter how angry you become. Then he told me what I told you when you complained about being treated badly. When you are in the presence of white people, you always look down, never in their eyes. If they address you, you always answer, no, sir, or yes, sir. You never talk back. That was the experience of my father when he was growing up in the 1920s and the 1930s. Now, let me read about problems that we had with housing, which, as you all know, you couldn't live in certain parts of the city. As my mother said to me during my near daily visits to her while she was on her deathbed suffering from cancer, we actually thought it was okay to live in Montclair. This is in Oakland, as the freeway from there was a quick commute to UC Radiation Laboratory in Berkeley, where your dad was just getting his first decent paying job. Montclair was, with the exception of very few minorities, all white, and it was well known that real estate agents would not show houses there to non-whites. My parents borrowed money from my aunt, my mother's sister, and began to search for a home. Every real estate broker marketing homes in Montclair area refused to show homes to my parents, citing the restrictive covenants in the deeds which forbade home ownership to Orientals, along with other minorities. The truth, according to my mother, who spoke with Mrs. Smith, a social worker and our next door neighbor, was the brokers were afraid if they broke the color line, they would be branded as traitors to the white race. Now, during the 30s to the 60s, there was also difficulty with getting jobs. And in my family, it was disheartening for my father. This is what he said. I was discharged in 1946, the year you were born, and had a family to feed. The economy was booming and jobs were plentiful. Because the union refused to promote me, I applied for job after job, but was rejected at every turn. Rejections were sometimes accompanied by outrageous comments. We don't hire Japs, so why would we hire Chinks? Why would we hire a Chink when so many white veterans are available? And why don't you go back to where you came from and find a job? We don't want your kind here. It was 1946. Now, in fact, when I attended school in Oakland, junior high school and high school, I attended a segregated high school and junior high school. Montera Junior High School and Skyline High School in those days was segregated. Now, what I want to do now is to go to period number 3. Now, pretty much the Chinese could live wherever they wanted to live, in addition to all the other things that they could do, voting and testifying in court, and even immigrating, although there was a quota. But still, job opportunities were very limited for the Chinese. We could go to college, but once we got out of college, finding a job was not easy. Let me talk a little bit about what happened to me, which was I had just graduated from law school and I had worked in the city attorney's office. It was 1978, and I left the Alameda City Attorney's Office to enter private practice. Wanting to engage in trial practice, I held myself out as a litigator. One day in a faraway county in California, I had arrived early for a hearing in the county courthouse. Upon checking in with the court clerk at the assigned courtroom, she excused herself and went back through a door. Returning, she motioned to me to follow her. She ushered me into the judge's chambers, where he was sitting behind the desk. He looked me up and down and then said, "What are you doing here?" I replied, "My name is Bruce Quan, and I am counsel for the plaintiff, Your Honor." "I know that. I mean, what are you doing here?" "I don't understand, Your Honor." "You don't belong here." So now we move to period number 4, which is 1990s to the present. We have more and more people in politics. We have more and more people in visible positions in the media and entertainment. But still, we have a problem. And the problem is that there still is a racial tension. And that racial tension is now most evident in what started in the 1990s at Berkeley, when white alumni and white state legislators complained about too many Chinese at Cal Berkeley. And now today, there are problems with the admissions to certain universities of people of Asian descent, particularly Chinese descent. And most recently, we have problems with in San Francisco at Lowell High School. Now, we also have highly educated young Chinese who are coming out of law school, who are getting their MBAs, but still find that there are career advancement blockages, particularly in the legal, in corporations, and in the finance area. And the question will be, when will those blockages ever disappear? So with that, I want to end my discussion and just tell you that within my book, Bitter Roots, you will find that in each generation, we start off with things that we aren't able to access as people in the United States, to where we now have access, but still there is a strong undercurrent of racial animosity which affects Chinese Americans. Harvey?
There's there was one comment from James who said that Lew Hing was a major donor to the Donghua Pharmacy and Chinese Hospital.
Yes, the Donghua was set up by merchants in Chinatown during the bubonic plague in 1900. And the city fathers refused access to the Chinese for treatment. And so the merchants got together and donated the money to build the first Chinese hospital in America. And then later on, my great-grandfather also was a major donor to the current Chinese hospital.
Another question from your talk was, you talked about how your great-grandfather Lew Hing was targeted. Would you say he was targeted or taken down because of his success?
Yes.
And every one of his enterprises, businesses was affected. Was it a coordinated type of targeting, or yeah?
I have some people who are researching. Here's one of the and let me just say this, that I'm a member of the Friends of the Bancroft Library, and what we're trying to do at the Bancroft Library, because it has so many resources, to try and convince families that still have papers to allow them to be accessed, so that we can find out through research what happened. It just so happens that my family were a bunch of pack rats. And so we have a lot of documents that are still being looked through, and a lot of those documents are in Chinese. So we are still trying to figure out whether or not it was a coordinated effort by white society or whether or not it was individual. We do know that with respect to the bank, what everybody should know is that in California, there were 10 Oriental Banks that were formed from 1900 to 1910. 9 were Japanese banks formed by Japanese, and 1 was Canton Bank. By 1930, all the banks were closed for quote unquote mismanagement. And in the Chinese community, it wasn't until 1962 that you had another bank chartered, and that was the Cathay Bank. So with respect to that, we think that there was concerted effort to close down the Oriental Banks. Now, with respect to the China Mail steamship lines, there was, during that period of time, the ships transiting from Asia to America, and most of those ships carried opium. Not only China Mail steamship lines, but all the other ships. And there was a law that fined any ship that was caught with that. The fines were very, very heavy. It was only against the China Mail steamship lines that the fines were not reduced, or the bond, the posting of the bond was cost so much that it was driven into bankruptcy, and the government then seized all the assets. So then there's a third one called Wamuk. Wamuk Holdings was a big business down in Mexicali, Mexico. And that, we believe, was taken down by the US government. So those can be read about in the book.
There's a question from Hong Yan.
Oh, hi, Hong Yan. How are you doing?
Yeah.
Yes,
The question, there's a comment and a question related. Said, thank you for sharing your family history. Apparently, Chinese people had very limited power before the 60s, especially. The question is, did they resist racism in any forms? You know, how did they resist racism during this time? Yeah.
The Chinese formed the very first civil rights organization in America. It was initially called the Native Sons of the Golden State, because they were not allowed to join the Native Sons of the Golden West. That name, the state refused to allow that name to be used because of the conflict. And so it became the Chinese American Citizens Alliance. Now, before that, the CCBA, the Chinese Benevolent Association, Consolidated Association, or 6 companies, along with the Council General, had funded white lawyers to fight against the discriminatory laws in the 19th century. Now, since the 60s, we have had more and more what I would call organizations that are concerned about how the Chinese have been treated, or at least advocating for positions, increasing the protection for the Chinese. You have 1970s, the formation of OCA, Organization of Chinese Americans, based in Washington, D.C. And most recently here in California, you have APAPA, which is the Asian Pacific Public Information. I can't remember what the acronym stands for, but there are organizations that have been formed to help in the arena of politics and public policy. Next question.
Peter has a question. Peter Harakoshi.
Gosh, only 50 years, Peter.
Thanks for sharing your family story. Did you discover most of this information from your family's documents? I heard you mention Bancroft Library. What other resources were you able to find helpful?
I was able to, Himmark Lai was alive and Phil Troy was alive. They helped immensely. I also went to the Bancroft Library myself when I was, one of my majors was Asian American Studies back in 1971 when I graduated, and I used the resources of Bancroft Library to help me write my thesis, which was on the history of Chinese in California. So there are a lot of resources to help. There's the CHSA, the Chinese Chinese, oh, what's CSA, Harvey? It's over in San Francisco.
Chinese Historical Society of
Yeah,
America.
CHSA, Chinese Historical Society. Um, and so there are a lot of resources, along with the fact that I actually, for 10 years, every Wednesday had lunch with my father. I don't know if any of you have ever had the opportunity to try and pry information out of your parents, but I did. I sat with my mother, unfortunately on her deathbed, for hours when she talked about her life and her parents' life and her grandparents' life. And then with my father, we met for near 500 lunches every Wednesday at the same restaurant in Oakland, Chinatown, where I was able, for the last part of his life, to be able to get some of the relevant information that appears in the book Bitter Roots, particularly about, and I'll just share this with you, he gave me 2 pistols. And he said, this one is your great-grandfather's and this one is your grandfather's. I says, okay, so why did they have these pistols? And it took me until about, I would say about a month before his death, before he would tell me why they had the pistols and the story behind them. And that is in the book.
Another question that comes up is the, see, my class is also reading Judy Young's book, Unbound Feet, about
Yes.
the role of women, and in particular, there was the merchant women, the Muay Thais, prostitutes, and there was some comparison and discussion about comparing Lew Hing's advantage because he was a male, being in a patriarchal society, and Lew Hing's wife, who had lots of disadvantages. And you talked about how she felt depressed about her life in America. Can you address some of that?
Sure. First, let me just say that many of you are aware of the Page Act of 1875, which presumed that any Chinese woman that wanted to have entry into the United States was here for the purpose of prostitution. So they devised, that is the people who were implementing that law devised a Byzantine way to keep Chinese women out of the United States. Now, my great-grandmother came in 1877, not speaking a word of English, went through 5 rigorous examinations before she was admitted, but she was admitted to the United States and they were married in 1877. Now, one of the problems was that there were very few women. I think in her year, I believe there were only 57 Chinese women admitted. And I don't know if Judy has that in her book, but only 57 and very few. So there were very few women in Chinatown. And so she was obviously very lonely and very depressed, mostly because of that. Also because she couldn't go back to China because in 1882, you had the Exclusion Act and only the merchants could go back and forth. The wives couldn't go back and be guaranteed that they would be readmitted. So that was the cause of her depression. But you're right. My grandfather actually had 2 wives. So that was apparently common among merchants.
Esther had a comment about the largest protest in 19th century was when the Chinese railroad workers went on strike, 1867. So that would be an important form of resistance.
They went
to
on
oppression.
strike. They went on strike for more money.
Yeah.
And they eventually forced Charles Crocker to give them more money.
Yeah. And then there was another comment about wanting to ask you about the GI Bill. Was that was your father a beneficiary of the GI Bill? Or?
My father went to Berkeley before. He started Berkeley in 1936. There was no GI Bill.
Okay.
So, and I should make a comment. The reason why he didn't finish Berkeley was because he married my mother. And even though my grandmother was Sayup, she wanted people to know that she was Sayup and my mother was Sayup. So when my father and my mother went to Reno and got married, for a short period of time, my grandparents disowned my father. That was how antagonistic the Samyap and the Sayup were with each other.
With regards to the Samyap and Seyu antagonism, you mentioned earlier about a boycott.
Yes.
Was it the Seyu boycott of
the
the
Samyap
merchants?
There was a organization called the Seyu Quan, which was the Merchants Association, had set up this. The Huiguans were set up to help their brethren. It was a social control by the merchants. So when somebody from that area came into the United States, they were registered with the Huiguan, and then when they left, they had to register to go out. They had to get an exit permit. And so when the Sayup were complaining about the monopoly by the Samyap merchants, the Seyu Huiguan then backed them, and you had a several-year boycott of the Samyap, and that actually was one of the reasons why you had the split between the two, and then you also had the formation in 1908 of the Chinese, I believe it was 1908, of the Chinese Chamber of Commerce. That was forced by the Council General to try to stop this back and forth bickering between the two groups.
Were one of the challenges related to the Samyap dominated CCBA decision to boycott the Gary Act, where they were requiring registrations,
Yes.
ID registrations. Yeah.
Okay, so as part of one of the provisions of the Gary Act, which was the renewal of the 1882 Exclusion Act, was that the Chinese had to register and carry with them a certificate of registration on their certificate of residence, on their person at all times. And if they were outside in public and accosted by a public official, I assume a police officer, and didn't have the certificate on their person, even with babies, my understanding was they were subject to either a heavy fine or could be deported. And so the CCBA hired attorneys to fight that, and they asked each person in Chinatown to contribute $1 and also refused to register. And when many in the Chinatown refused to follow the CCBA, then apparently there was a vacuum of governance in Chinatown. And at the same time, then the Tonga War started. That was the mid 1890s. And actually, that was one of the reasons why in 1895 that the Samyap merchants formed the Four Family Association, as well as another organization called the Four Brothers. And the Four Brothers was an organization to protect their association members from unfair hostilities.
Do you have any thoughts on how the Samyap and Seyu differences were eventually overcome shortly after? Or?
Well, I think it happened in the 20s and the 30s. I think by that time, I think everybody realized we were in the same boat. That we weren't allowed to do things regardless of whether you were Samyap or Seyu. We were still, as my mother used to say, you look in the mirror and that's who they see you as. So they didn't make, the larger society did not make a differentiation between whether you were Samyap or Seyu to discriminate against you. If you were Chinese, they discriminated against you. That was it. And I think it was probably intermarriage because, oops, I'm sorry. So by that time, I think there were just not enough eligible people to get married within each of the groups. So they married each other.
And we have time for, I guess, two questions. One, who did you write the book for? How did you choose to use the story narrative interspersed throughout your book? Okay.
Oh, somebody read my book. I wrote the book, as I said in the beginning, because I felt that as you and I 50 years ago started Asian American Studies along with other students, the idea that there was not even mention of the Chinese in American history. I'm not talking about Chinese American history, I'm talking about in American history. And so I wanted to write the book so that it could be used in programs at every educational level so that people really knew that we are not the model minority, that we were, because of our unique circumstances, we became the model minority, and that has stuck with us, even though we were as aggressive in fighting for our rights here in America as any other ethnic group.
And then there's a question to everybody in the audience. I wonder how many here were born before 1945.
I was born in 1946.
I was born in 1948.
So, but let me just say this, that right now, we were lucky because we were allowed to go to Berkeley at a time when there was not the problems we have today with competing to get into Berkeley. And it was not as costly. Back then, my first 2 years at Berkeley in 1964 to 66, we had no tuition. And now it makes it much more difficult for immigrant families to be able to afford to send their children to a Berkeley, both because of the limitations on enrollment as well as the cost. And so, every generation, let me just end with this, every generation pushes the envelope of acceptability out just a little further. As I mentioned, from period one, we started with, it was basically Jim Crow laws. And if you talk to people from the South, like part of my family, the Long family, side of my family that came from Georgia, they will tell you about how the Chinese were treated there right up to the end of the Jim Crow period in 1960. We went just a little further, mainly because they had restricted and thought they had taken care of us by putting in exclusion acts. So we then became less of a threat than the African Americans, and certainly less of a threat now than the Latinos are to the larger society. So that's why they call us the model minority. They've been able to beaten us into submission, so to speak. But I'm pleased that these new generations are willing to speak up and get involved in politics and public policy. So I'm grateful for that. So any of the students, Professor Dong, in your class who are thinking about where to put their energies in a career, think about public policy and politics and law, because I think those are the areas where we can have a greater impact.
Okay, thank you, Peter, for your talk today and presentation. It definitely raises a lot of areas to continue investigating Chinese American history and its relevance to today. The next event that's coming up is March 17th, same time, same station, with William Dare, Jeannie Dare, and Alvin Jaw. It will be a panel talk on the effects of the Cold War on Chinese American families. And on May 7th, Friday, 1 to 3 p.m., will be student podcast projects. Student teams will be creating audio podcasts on various topics, and will be interviewing people in the community, such as the Reverend Norman Fong, Katie Quan, labor organizer, Laura Jo Fu, labor attorney, John Jung, Chinese American historian, Russell Jung, professor at SF State and involved in Stop the AAPI Hate Violence. So with that, we'll end today's event and thank everybody for attending. Okay.
Thank you, Harvey.
Thank you, Bruce.